Welcome to the Bear Market Brief podcast. I'm your host, Aaron, and I'm happy to report that we've made it through 2020. Now, we've covered a fairly wide variety of issues over our episodes in 2020, so this time I wanted to look back. In hindsight, what were the key trends in Russia this year? How did they evolve? And looking forward, what might change in 2021? Joining us this time is Andras Toth-Czifra, Russia analyst and author of the No Yardstick blog. I've been reading his blog a few years and really recommend it. You can check it out at noyardstick.com. So with all that said, let's dive in. Andras, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, it's good to be here.
So to kick things off, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background in Eurasia studies, and you also have a blog that I'm sure the listeners would love to hear about too.
Yeah, so hello everyone. I am a political analyst, originally from Hungary, hence the unusual name. I, as you mentioned, I have a blog entitled No Yardstick, which I've been writing for, I think, more than 10 years now, which focused originally on commentary on Russian politics. Lately, I've been focusing more on the regions and the relationship between the Moscow federal government and regional governments, governors, and regional politics, simply because I think that's emerging as an important political development, or it has emerged as an important political development in the past couple of years. I have worked in Brussels and I worked in Berlin for think tanks and in the European Parliament before. Right now, I'm working for a business risk intelligence company, but the blog itself is the stable point, and that's why I have had the honor to get to know a lot of other researchers in the field, including you. And I think that's more or less the background that I have. It's mostly political analysis.
So would highly recommend listeners you go check out his blog. He has some really, really fascinating insights on Russia. Turning to Russia and today's meat and potatoes, this is the last edition of the Bear Market Brief podcast for 2020. And as such, I wanted to do two things. First, to look back on this interesting, I think is a diplomatic way of putting it, year we've all had, and then look forward to 2021. So kind of from a 30,000 foot viewpoint, looking back on what's happened this year, less the individual micro stories, but more the broader trends. What would you say has kind of been the key threads that have been visible in Russia looking back?
So if you're talking about politics, of course, we all remember that the year started with a bang, namely Vladimir Putin announcing a thorough revamp of the constitution, which first looked as if he had been preparing to preparing the ground for whoever comes after him, or the system that would come after him. There were rumors that balance of power between the different institutions in the government would be readjusted. And what happened instead, and the jury is still out on whether this was originally planned or Putin sort of made this up on the fly, is the position of the president became stronger, and there are now more guarantees for former presidents. For instance, they can take up lifetime positions in the Federation Council, or they will not be able to be prosecuted for crimes committed after they leave office. At the same time, we saw the emergence of previously obscure institutions like the State Council, which is an advisory body chaired by the president and mostly made up of regional leaders, which left us guessing for a long time whether that was going to be the position that Putin would take if he were to choose to retire from office. And parallel to this, we also saw the new Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin sort of throwing his weight around, which more and more so towards the end of the year, when he sort of asserted his position in the government. Mishustin was appointed primarily, or so it seemed at the beginning of the year, to oversee the implementation of the national projects, the 12 big development projects that Putin announced in 2018. for the next 6 years, 2 of which has already passed, and that was not going well. And of course, then COVID came, and that became the central story. And it is, to me, if I were to summarize it in a nutshell, the year's main story was the difference between what Putin planned and what happened, and the fact that even with the pandemic, he was able to implement some of his agenda, but the message that this implementation sent to both Russians and to the world was very different from what I think he wanted to send.
So to dive into, what Putin wants, and there's kind of a piece of advice that echoes around the Russia studies field, which is don't play Kremlinology too much. It's too opaque. There's no way we can truly know what Putin wants, what is actually happening behind closed doors in Moscow. And to now completely ignore that advice, looking back on the year, what do you think Putin wanted? And I think we actually discussed this on an earlier episode of the podcast, talking about what Putin wants. Now looking back, what did Putin want at the beginning of the year, and what actually transpired? I mean, nobody would have wanted a global pandemic. That's obvious. But how did what actually transpired, how did the pandemic impact what the optics of his plans were?
First of all, I would like to avoid a trap of deciding here and now whether Putin wanted to retire or not, because we don't know that. It is the question that he probably wants us to be guessing, but I don't have I don't have sources in the Kremlin as some Russia watchers do or claim to do. All I can say is that the constitutional reform, the way it was executed, suggested to me that there were 2 parts. First of all, Putin wanted to create an institutional arrangement in which whichever way he chooses to run again in 2024, or to retire, or when I say retire, of course, I just mean retire from the presidency, but not from the system as a whole, he would be safe. He would be safe politically, he would be safe physically, he would be safe financially, legally. And this, I believe, he did achieve. The other part of the constitutional reform, and this is often ignored, or at least the discussions about it are superseded by discussions about Putin's place and his future, is that it was going to be a sort of synthesis, a summary of what Putinism is, what the past 20 years, or how the past 20 years have changed Russia, from the centralization of political power and fiscal revenues, which I think is one of the big stories of the past 2 decades, to the sort of the conservative agenda that Putin pushed in, especially in the past decade, to how Russia is governed and how it should be governed. And it was going to be a celebration almost of Putinism. And what we saw at the beginning of the year was a kind of expected timeline from the adoption of the Constitution by referendum through the Victory Day parades, which, if you remember, a lot of foreign dignitaries and heads of state were invited to, and these 2 together, knowing also how important the memory of the Second World War and the victory in the Second World War is in sort of the historical worldview of Putin and his system, should have amounted to a grand legitimation of Putinism and whatever it embodies about ideologically, but mostly politically. And this, I think, didn't happen. And what the pandemic did instead is that it exposed, first of all, the imbalances that exist in Russian politics in this system of governance that came to define Putinism. This over-centralized system of governance where most regions depend on federal funding or funding from the federal budget, which is basically redistributed income that flows in partially from the regions. The lack of political power on lower levels and how it's concentrated in Moscow. And when I say Moscow, I don't just say I don't just mean the federal government. I also mean Moscow, the capital, and how much discontent and how many different kinds of grievances this over-centralized system needs to keep under wraps in order to ensure its own stability. So that became the message, which I'm pretty sure was not what Putin wanted the message to be.
So turning to, I think federalization has been or centralization, reduction of federalization has certainly been a key theme of Putinism. Going back to the 90s, regional governors, regional leadership really mattered. And that has increasingly not been the case. I think it's safe to say, with maybe the exception of Moscow itself. And yet you've argued that this seems to be changing. I think the fact that there's a pandemic, the fact that there's these national projects that can't be completely implemented all at the federal level, there's a lot of need for, I guess, rubber to meet the road as far as policy implementation. Especially, I think COVID is the most critical example of this. So do you see this sort of institutional framework, and we'll talk about institutional framework more, but do you see the federal relationship changing? Is it sustainable?
I don't see it changing, but it's not sustainable in short. So what the pandemic and how it was handled in the regions, and especially how it was handled fiscally, the sort of the fiscal imbalances that it exposed, and the political imbalances that it exposed. Like, if I'm really going to simplify what happened in 2020 with the pandemic and regions, I would say that Putin was trying to push the responsibility for handling the pandemic onto regional governments, and at the same time did not have the necessary fiscal means to do so, and did not have the necessary experience. It was I don't want to call it a panic decision, because I have no idea whether it was indeed a sort of a rushed decision that needed to be taken, and it wasn't sufficiently thought through. But it was certainly a forced decision, or it seemed like a forced decision. What then happened is that some regional governments tried to actually use these powers, and they were either looking for nods from the center, or they were not getting the necessary fiscal aid that they needed to implement certain decisions, for instance, to support local businesses or to support local hospitals. Regions as a whole had been a fairly sorry bunch when it came to budgeting and political powers. Like, and that's something that is really like that started under Yeltsin, but it has been really the story of the past 2 decades, and yeah.
And one of the things I would add, just for the context for listeners, is that it's not just that these regions. To clarify here, there's a difference between Moscow, the city of Moscow, Moscow Oblast, and regions. Not to single out Saransk, but it's coming to mind for whatever reason. A big difference in fiscal capacity normally, but keep in mind, COVID is happening after many regions, or the whole of Russia, faced a recession in 2014, 2015, and then years of stagnation. So these regional budgets, to begin with, in a lot of cases, weren't in a great place. So important context, and please continue.
Yes, exactly. So interestingly though, when you mentioned regional budgets and their position, regional budgets actually were able in 2019 to accumulate some reserves. Not all of them, but a lot of regional budgets accumulated reserves. It was a better year. There was more investment. The national projects started, which again, like as you also observed, I think maybe a year ago, you wrote an article on this, that the national projects were not implemented fully, and the money allocated, or the money that the federal government wanted to allocate on the national projects was never fully allocated, and it was never that's why Mishustin was put in charge probably. But there was some success. There were some successes. Some investments started, and regional budgets were actually in a better state at going into 2020. But the reserves that they had accumulated in 2019 were very quickly exhausted. So regional budgets, on the whole, lost around more than 500 billion rubles in the first 8 months of the year. And they were not fully compensated, or rather, some of them were overcompensated, and some of them were only partially compensated. And there is no, it's very difficult to dig into why some regions were compensated and some regions were not compensated. People with wider and more knowledge than me have struggled to understand this, and regions certainly struggle to understand this. But what this leads to is that it's very difficult to plan ahead. And so when it comes to the 2021 budgeting, regions don't know, in most cases, how much money they can expect to get from the federal center in addition to what they would normally. They do not know whether cheap budgetary loans that the finance ministry has tried to replace loans from banks with in the past couple of years to ease the debt burden on regions. They don't know how quickly those loans will be exhausted or limited. So and it rolls on. It rolls on to municipalities, which in turn very often heavily depend on regional budgets. So it's a multi-level problem, and in the end, since regions cannot really go bankrupt, I know that it's sometimes from time to time it comes up in Russian and in foreign press that this region goes bankrupt and that region goes bankrupt. What happens is that regions go illiquid, so to say, and the finance ministry takes them under its strict stewardship, and regions lose the last vestiges of their financial autonomy until they are back on track and they can handle their debt, they can handle their deficit. So in the end, the federal budget will have to foot the bill somehow, but regional autonomy will suffer.
And at the same time, I think talking about, again, a case study here, I think Khabarovsk could also see the case that regional governors, I think the Kremlin has kind of laid down clearly that, the room for charismatic policy that endears you to the population, that's out ahead of, national leadership, is not acceptable. Is that safe to say?
It is safe to say. That's actually the big contradiction behind what should be happening and what is happening. So what should be happening is regions should probably, in order to handle both the national projects. By the way, the national projects were rolled back, as we know, from 2024 to 2030. But this doesn't mean that governors are not evaluated based on whether they spend money on the national projects. They still are. So the spending targets are still there. It's just that regions now have all these other spending obligations in healthcare and so on that they will need to spend. So this just complicates everyone's life, both with the national projects and with COVID. I think the natural answer in a working federalism would be a federalist system would be to allow regional governors more autonomy, both fiscal and political, and so that they should not be always negotiating the next step with the federal center, be it buying equipment or bailing out local business, or supporting investment. But that's also something that the Kremlin is trying to prevent because of what happened in Khabarovsk. I mean, not only because of that, but that was a prime example of what the Kremlin is afraid of. That here comes a government who was not even a non-systemic actor. He was very much a systemic opposition politician who saw an opportunity in a surprise electoral victory, and started hesitantly at first, but then in a certain regard quite openly with the local population, expressing that that's where he was deriving his legitimacy from and not from the federal center.
And dangerous thing to say as a leader in Russia.
Yes, and so what we like, if I zoom out a little bit again, what this return of regional politics is another big development that we have seen not only in 2020 but basically since 2018, or if I'm going to be strict about it, then maybe since 2016, 2017, when a looming debt crisis was averted, but the money still disproportionately went to Moscow, the capital, instead of allowing regions a bit more fiscal breathing space and development. And I see two broad conflicts: elites, regional elites versus Moscow elites over rent. It's not always political. Sometimes it's about whether big state-owned companies are allowed to encroach on regions. For instance, in digital surveillance, we have seen, or waste collection, and sort of take opportunities away from companies connected to regional elites. And we see a growing animosity between the population of certain regions versus the federal government. And this is what we saw in Khabarovsk, but there are also other regions where, for instance, the environmental protests that we have seen in several regions from the Arkhangelsk Oblast, Komi Republic, Bashkortostan, were really mostly about bad governance and animosity towards a big company that was either seen as representing foreign as in Moscow interests or interests of another part of the country, or not even based in the region. So in these two conflicts, regional political elites, for instance, governors, and regional party members and deputies, I think increasingly notice that they can take sides. Not completely freely, but they can sort of strengthen their position in negotiating, for instance, with the center by opening up to local movements. So this is more or less what the Khabarovsk protests and what the arrest of Sergei Furgal reflected, this development, and how wary the Kremlin is of it. So I believe that going ahead we will see more of these types of protests. I'm not sure if we will see a protest movement as unexpected and as vigorous and large, and not only because the Khabarovsk protest movement's real strength was not just that not just in its size and its resilience in the region, but also that Russians in other regions heard about it, and it was on the political agenda not only in the Khabarovsk Krai but also in other regions. And similarly, when it comes to the environmental protests, the Shias protests, which were against a landfill in the
Oblast, way up north,
in the Arkhangelsk Oblast, which would have been built for to accommodate Moscow's municipal waste, and the Kushtau protests in Bashkortostan, which erupted against the development of a sacred mountain, like industrial development of a sacred mountain. So those two protests also resonated outside their regions, and especially in the Kushtau and Shias protests. The Kushtau protesters learned from Shias protesters. There were contacts between the two protest movements. They copied, the Kushtau protesters copied the tactics of the Shias protesters. So not all of these protests are going to be political, always. and they are certainly not, in the case of the environmental protests, they are certainly not directed against Putin or against the central tenets of his system, but just by sort of energizing the politics in the region and by forcing regional elites to react to these protests, they have the potential to stir up politics stir up the contract between regional governors, regional political leaders, and federal political leaders.
So turning ahead now to 2021, in the few minutes we have left, some big questions, I guess, remain on the radar for Putin, for his team. We have the need to address COVID. It's still looming large. Related, although not entirely related, there's Duma elections coming up, and we're already getting the initial polling, and this happens every time there are elections in Russia. United Russia's support is down, they're doomed, it's going to be a disaster, and then, of course, political mobilization happens. United Russia gets the results it needs in most places, and this tends to be a trend. But looking ahead, what signposts, signals are you looking for as 2021 develops that might point us how things are going?
So if you're staying for a second at the Duma election, one of the big macro trends that in Russian politics that I see emerging in 2021 is a growing gap between what Russians expect, the policy outcomes that Russians expect from the system, and the actual outcomes that the system is able to produce. So I have argued back, I think, in August, when the Duma changed the electoral law in order to allow 3-day voting and allow the restriction of observers, that for tinkering with electoral rules and rigging have been part of Russian politics and Russian elections for a long time, for decades. So that's nothing new. What is new is that throughout the first, let's say, 16, 17, 18 years of Putin's being in power in either as prime minister or president, however rigged elections were, and they were not always rigged at the same level, it was understood that elections broadly produced an outcome that most of the voters, even if it didn't correspond exactly what they would have voted for, they could live with. Now, what we have seen with the emergence of Navalny's smart voting, which the federal government is trying very hard to suppress in various ways, is that this gap has grown. This gap has grown large enough for it to be uncomfortable for the Kremlin. So, for instance, if they want to engineer a resounding victory with high turnout, as it happened in the constitutional plebiscite this year, they are able to do it. But they have needed more and more obvious and grotesque and tinkering and rigging to make this happen. And I don't think that a political system can support this kind of tension for long enough. The question is what happens if this becomes unbearable. I do think that if the Kremlin really wants to, it can guarantee United Russia a 2/3 majority next year, even as the party's popularity rating is around 30% nationally. But first of all, the electoral system is such, and the rules governing elections and are such that this can be guaranteed if it needs to be guaranteed. But it might be an overreach, if you know what I mean. One of the interesting things that happened this year was, and maybe I will leave it at this, is that Putin's trust rating was falling much faster than his approval rating. So this might not look like a major difference to any casual observer of Russian politics, but Putin's approval rating, it is massaged very efficiently through state and state-affiliated media, And it doesn't really tell us much about his actual position, his actual popularity.
So the approval rating is your traditional, do you approve of the job that Putin is doing? The trust rating is an unprompted question. So they'll say, name your most trusted politician in Russia. So what has fallen is people are volunteering Putin at an increasingly rare rate. Not that it's rare, outright, but less than they used to. So
yeah, that's the important part. He is still the most trusted politician in Russia, but his trust rating was falling much more precipitously than his approval rating, and there were actually points. There were points in 2020 when you could see what that means in practice, what it could mean in practice. So, for instance, when Putin went live on air and promised COVID-related bonuses to medical personnel, and those bonuses were then not paid out or not fully paid out, then medical personnel turned to Putin and started demanding. First of all, they started protesting and they started demanding the bonuses from Putin. And the real danger in that story for Putin was that he promised something popular, and then his order was not carried out for various reasons, which mostly have to do with how regional governments handled and hospitals handled the payments of these bonuses. But his orders are not carried out. So if your voters do not doubt your intention, but they start to doubt your ability to implement your will, that's when things start to look very uncomfortable if you are Vladimir Putin. And if this trend continues into 2021, I think that also might be a sign that people's trust is falling in the authenticity of this system. That with all its deficiencies and its lies and its contradictions, it is able to produce the outcomes that they want or that they can live with. Every once in a while, it will turn out that people want something that the authorities are unable or unwilling to give to them. And the more often this happens, the more elections will matter, and the more elections will be able to accommodate a system like smart voting. And if that avenue is closed, then what happens is the question.
And a big question to leave off on. Andras, thank you so much for joining us today. It was great to hear from you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that's all, folks. Thanks to Andras for joining, and wishing you all a very happy and healthy holiday season. We really appreciate your support over the last year. Be sure to follow BNB Russia and Ukraine at the Twitter handle @BearMarketBrief. BNB Russia and Ukraine is an initiative of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, that's FPRI, a think tank based in Philadelphia. For more information on this project and on others, stop by fpri.org. We'll catch you next year.